exist in most countries of the world. For example, I happen to have been to a lot of meetings in the last few years in which someone gets up and makes a passionate and reasoned demand for democratic schools, and I have tartly shot back, "Nonsense. A school cannot be democratic. But by God, many need to be more democratic, and some, indeed, are admirably clear examples of autocracy." However, in broad terms, the number of different usages of democracy that have had any practical effect have not been all that many. By practical effect, I mean when there is some congruence between democracy perceived as a set of values and democracy perceived as a set of institutional arrangements. We can see this best if we consider the history both of the values and of the institutions that have been called democratic. There are two reasons for an initial historical approach. The first is that to understand any human institutions, we must know a little of what has gone before, why they were invented, or how they have evolved. Even Marx, believing in revolution, said that in order to change the world, we must first understand it, even if he was somewhat idealistic or just plain wrong about the possible extent of change, certainly about the timescales involved. The second reason is itself historical. When democracy began to enter into modern politics and society with the American and then the French revolutions, the leaders of these events looked back to what they took to be Greek and Roman precedents. They were painted and sculpted in classical togas and laurel wreaths, and they gave themselves Greek and Roman pseudonyms, both for provocation and protection, when they set down their reasoned principles and wrote tracts against royal government and oppression. And the particular pseudonyms they adopted told their readers something of where they were coming from. A Brutus was likely to argue for more immediate action than would a constitutionally minded Cicero. For several centuries, the revived memory of the Greek city-states, the citizen states, and Rome of the Republican era had haunted the West, as real fear for some and as a speculative hope for others. What had been done before could be done again. And it is always necessary to remember that we are considering a term that has had no meaning at all in most societies for most of human history, and that while most governments in the modern world feel the need to call themselves democratic, many are at or beyond the outer limits of any of the main usages of the term historically. I like the challenge of this book because to write briefly and to try to simplify without distortion an overwhelmingly important but also highly complex matter is more difficult than to write at length. So, a double word of warning. 3 somewhat different stories or accountings must run side by side, which I will try to disentangle and relate to each other more carefully at the end. There is democracy as a principle or doctrine of government. There is democracy as a set of institutional arrangements or constitutional devices. And there is democracy as a type of behavior, say the antithesis of both deference and of unsociability. They do not always go together. Voting for leaders, for instance, is a democratic device. But many medieval monks in a highly autocratic church elected their own abbots. Viking war bands would elect a new leader if a chief died on campaign, and Horatio tells us that Hamlet's dying breath was to give his vote to Fortinbras to be King of Denmark. Not how we do it in England, but an Elizabethan audience had evidently heard of such oddities as elective monarchy. They did not need program notes or a chorus to tell them. The second word of warning is that the history of what is meant by democratic has been hard, until very recently, to disentangle from that of republic and republican. The tradition of Roman republicanism was revived in the 16th and 17th centuries, finding its finest advocacy and analysis in Machiavelli's discourses, and was an animating idea in the American and French revolutions. And while it was not democratic as most of us would think of democracy, in that it firmly denied that everyone was fit to vote, and gave some good reasons, Yet in some senses, it was more democratic than many of us today would